Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Martha Simmons with another session of Preaching and Preachers on Facebook Live and YouTube. Come on in and let me know that you are out there. It's a sunny Monday in Atlanta, and I hope the weather is great where you are. Come on in and let me know that you are out there, as today we talk about the Chitlin circuit. All right, the Chitlin circuit. See people coming in. Come on in. Let me know that you are out there. And when you come in, tag someone and let them know that they can jump on the broadcast right now, or it'll be up on my Facebook page for a couple of weeks and on YouTube for at least a couple of years. Come on in. Wendell Craig Woods, it's good to have you with me. All right. He says, good afternoon from Plainfield, New Jersey. All right. All right. Sherry Dampier. Good afternoon from Brooklyn, New York. All right. Come on in. Let me shout out and say good morning to my people on the West Coast who get up early to check me out live. Shouting out to people in the Midwest, the folk on the East Coast for sure, and always the people in the dirty South. Come on in and let me know that you are out there. It is hot. I've got the air on and I am still sweaty. It is hot in Atlanta. All right. That's right. I see people shouting out other people, tagging other people. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and get started, since I'm going to say a lot today, because I've never done this subject, but I've spent a lot of time studying it. All right. And it's a subject that is important to me. And since this is Preaching and Preachers, I thought today I'd say a bit for preachers about preachers and preaching. All right. Let me get started. As always, I'm praying for those who are sick, praying for those who are suffering through a period of bereavement. I think we've all grieved last week. And today, I especially want to pray for all Christian educators. By way of announcement, let me say stay tuned for the broadcasts that are coming up in August. We got one on avoiding foreclosure and a great broadcast on chaplaincy. Today, because I've never done this subject, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. Feel free to put your questions in the chat on this session of Preaching and Preachers. All right, through the sweat, let me go ahead and get started. Today, I am talking about the Chitlin circuit. Preaching circuits were established as early as the 1760s in America, thanks to the Methodist clergy John Wesley. And he brought with him from England the concept of circuits. And Harry Hoosier, John Morant, and Andrew Bryan are a few Black notable Methodist clergy who were circuit riders. And they began preaching on the circuit around 1790 through the mid-1800s. The early African Methodist Episcopal denomination, which was formed in 1816, also had circuit riders, since their denomination grew out of the white Methodist denomination. they had circuit riders. But unlike the white Methodist preaching circuits, the Chitlin preaching circuit was not marked out by maps by men who were leading denominations. The preaching Chitlin circuit began formally in the early 1910s. It started maybe 5 or 6 years before that, but formally around 1910, and it was alongside the singing Chitlin circuit in the South. Uh, Both were preceded by the minstrel shows of the 1820s and 30s, in which blacks and whites in those minstrel shows would often appear in blackface makeup. The Black Baptist and the Pentecostal Chitlin circuit developed by word of mouth. Black preachers and people in communities devised a circuit for the gospel, starting with small towns where there was an appetite for preaching and where parishioners often attended church only twice a month on the first and fourth Sunday or the second and fourth Sunday. The preaching Chitlin circuit followed the singing Chitlin circuit in its development. The singing Chitlin circuit began in juke joints and shotgun shacks. Yes, there were juke joints in the 1800s during slavery, and especially after the end of the Civil War. The first juke joints were shacks built by plantation owners to give the enslaved places to blow off steam. Later, a juke joint or a shotgun shack could be any place where people could safely gather, especially in people's homes. The juke joints of the singing Chitlin circuit proliferated across the rural South by the 1890s, and musicians began to travel from one juke joint to another, and they formed the foundation of a circuit for Black entertainers. The practice of circulating between these venues became organized with the rise of blues music in the early 1900s, and it further developed into what became known as the singing Chitlin circuit by the 1930s. This period marked a time when artists, through word of mouth and venue owners cooperating, arranged performances across various juke joints and similar venues throughout the South. No one knows the exact year the Chitlin preaching circuit began, but its core beginnings are closely tied to the start of the Great Black Migration from the South to the North, which began in 1910. We do know that there were preachers who widely traveled the South preaching in the late 1800s, such as John Jasper, yes, the great John Jasper of the famous The Sun Do Move sermon. But he was not part of a circuit. Most of the roots of the Chitlin preaching circuit are only traceable through the singing Chitlin circuit. They almost go hand in hand with the singing circuit being just a bit earlier. Of course, we also know that most forms of Black entertainment had a Chitlin circuit. They all had a Chitlin circuit. That's why I didn't call this broadcast the preaching Chitlin circuit, because all forms of entertainment had a Chitlin circuit. There was a comedy Chitlin circuit, and people like Red Fox and Moms Mabley, Butterbean and Susie Edwards, Dewey Pigmeat Markham, and Tom Kingfish Moore and Lincoln Stepton Fetchit Perry were notables on that circuit. By the 1830s, Blacks were performing dramas or plays, and there was even a drama Chitlin circuit where Black performers wrote and performed plays. And some of the best known plays from the drama Chitlin circuit Some of the performers included Josephine Baker, Ethel Walker, and Bessie Smith. Some of those plays included Cinda, Cinda, which was a Black adaptation of Cinderella, Streets of Gold, Black Acres, The Legend of Joe Emma, The Lost Disciples, Swing Song, and Heaven Bound. There was a Chitlin drama circle, and that circuit continued. In fact, Tyler Perry, when he first started dressing as Ma Dear and going to circuits, he was a part of that Chitlin circuit. It continued. W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous sociologist and more, he even had some of what were called drama pageants. And these were reworked by colleges and churches to perform. He did highbrow dramas with large casts. It wasn't on the Chitlin circuit. And it didn't matter anyway, although many folks showed up to support Du Bois. The most viewed dramas, the most viewed plays, they were on the drama Chitlin circuit. The singing Chitlin circuit of blues, jazz, and soul, as I said, it began in juke joints and blues rooms in small towns in the Jim and Jane Crow South, and quickly spread far beyond that. Places such as Little Rock, Arkansas were on the circuit. In Louisiana, the circuit was hot in Shreveport and Tallulah, Louisiana. In Mississippi, there was Greenville, Hattiesburg, Jackson, Macomb, Vicksburg, and Yazoo City. They were all on the circuit. In Alabama, you could find the circuit in Dothan, Alabama, and Gadsden in Gadsden, Georgia. In Georgia, you found it in Atlanta, Augusta, Columbus, Macon, Savannah, and Waycross, Georgia. In Florida, you could find the circuit in Jacksonville, Pensacola, Petersburg, Tampa, and Sarasota. If you had a singing circuit, it meant that people would also come out to hear preachers, it turns out, because even if folk went to the juke joints and the shotgun shacks on Saturday, everybody still went to church on Sunday. So it makes sense that states like Mississippi were one of the earliest strongholds for the Chitlin circuit, because it was such a stronghold for the singing Chitlin circuit, along with Georgia and Louisiana. They crisscross. You could find the singing Chitlin circuit folk, the comedy, and the drama all tied together. And typically, the preaching Chitlin circuit followed similar paths. They could follow that juke joint singing circuit especially. The juke joints and shotguns shacks of the singing Chitlin circuit provided entertainers with accessibility, autonomy. You could sing or play your instrument any way you wanted to, as long as the people liked it. And it also offered the safety of the community. Everybody knew everybody who showed up in the early days. So the same thing was provided on the preaching Chitlin circuit. You had accessibility because people really wanted to hear preaching. You had the security of the community. Churches were like families. And then the Chitlin preaching circuit provided preachers with autonomy. They were not tied to white ways of preaching. They just had to honor the Bible and the culture. They couldn't preach what was being preached in white churches that hated and looked down on Black folk, and also who were using the Bible to do it. On the Chitlin preaching circuit, you also had to offer the sound of that era. You know how the sound of this era is cadence? The sound of that era was a bluesy sound with hooping, okay? And because preachers had autonomy, preachers could improve their preaching. And like the singing juke joint singers, they could give folk a variety of styles, including hooping, which eventually became a mainstay on the Chitlin circuit. The use of the term Chitlin circuit in the 1920s and 1930s tells us a great deal. At that time, chitlins were high eaten. The term was intended as a compliment, not pejoratively. Our people understood it. They loved chitlins and respected and loved the singers and preachers on the chitlin circuit. That's why there were so many who became staples as they traveled and traversed the circus. It was only after Europeans and educated Black folk began to look down on the term that it gained an air of disdain from those who wanted to avoid the uneducated and what they termed the uncultured view of our people. They started doing that in the 1930s, especially. In his book, Watch This, Jonathan Walton says of early Black preaching, it was characterized, by its dramaturgical, that's his word, his dramaturgical sense of excitement, entertainment value, and its efficacious release. C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya described the Black church as the first Black theater. And you all understand what I'm saying. And because they had autonomy, Chitlin circuit preachers were entertaining. And in this instance, I use the word entertaining as the opposite of dull. You could be a lot of things on the Chitlin circuit in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, but you could not be dull and remain. This is Dr. Martha Simmons with a session of Preaching and Preachers. I'm talking about all things on the Chitlin circuit. Today, you can you can put your questions in the chat, and don't forget to tag someone. On the Chitlin circuit in the 1910s and 20s, preachers could be paid with flour, eggs, hogs, and a little bit of cash. The circuit primarily consisted of 10 states. In its earliest formation, they were Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida. Cost and demographic changes led to Texas and Florida being removed from the circuit as staples places by the 1940s. By 1910, there were 114 Black newspapers. Can you believe that? Which covered the Black church, Black preachers, and the subject of Black preaching. Fewer than 20 of those newspapers remain today. They were papers like the Chicago Defender, which I read growing up, and it was widely read outside of Chicago, where it was headquartered. There was the Norfolk Journal and Guide, the Richmond Planet, the South Carolina Leader, and the Arkansas State Press, which started in a church. They all covered the Black preachers and the Black church. They knew Black preachers were highly regarded at that time in the Black community, and the Black church was still a powerful institution. Newspapers would sometimes indicate who would be preaching in what cities and towns on what days. Black newspapers covered all aspects of the Black church. They were instrumental both before and during the modern civil rights movement in, in designating Black churches as leading social institutions and religious institutions. In addition to the newspapers and word of mouth, you could hear the names of Chitlin Circuit preachers at denominational gatherings, especially Baptist and Pentecostal gatherings. Those newspapers also advertise the drama circuit and certainly the Chitlin entertainment circuit. And after white folk got involved, y'all did see Sinners, right? Um, the owners of venues, they started to own venues and put Black people in those venues. They advertised a great deal in Black newspapers. By the 1940s, there was a really robust Chitlin preaching circuit. And as Blacks migrated to larger cities such as Memphis and Detroit, some cities embraced the preachers of the Chitlin circuit who were making a name for themselves and had done so in the South. Memphis and Detroit became mainstays on the circuit. Those who preached on the circuit, as I said, were mainly Baptist and Holiness Pentecostal. It is almost impossible to determine who the main Chitlin Circuit preachers were in the 1910s and 20s, as little was written about most of them. If they did mention it when people were writing about preaching, their beginnings on the Chitlin circuit, if they wrote about it, even those who had been on the circuit didn't want much said. Also, by 1940, even those who were still heavily on the circuit were not boasting about it in public, lest they be attacked in newspapers and other religious gatherings. The voice of the educated preacher held sway, and you could go through any of the newspapers and you could see the educated preachers denigrating those who hooped and the Chitlin circuit. So even those who were on that circuit for a long time, they didn't say much about it. So very little is written about those preachers from the early years. So let me tell you about the nature of the preaching circuit. Conservative, it was conservative. It was Bible centered. And of course, it was chauvinistic. It was mainly all male. I want to say maybe 95% male. Some claimed that the people who preached on the Chitlin circuit were only offering escapist and pie in the sky preaching with a hoop. But I think homiletician Nick Peterson is on the mark when he says the following. He said, what you all missed was that their vision of heaven was an indictment against the hell that structured their lives here on earth. Their faith was bold enough to imagine an existence bereft of these wicked machinations, and even when it failed in the particulars, it necessarily proclaimed that this age must end. Even when personal piety seemed the ticket into the promised land, their confidence in a Savior acquainted with their grief and sorrow birthed in them practices of disavowal, renunciation, and resistance that forsook the vainglory structurings of this world. A robust theology of heaven is a political theology. And even if we cannot perfectly articulate what heaven is, a theology of heaven affirms over and over again that it certainly ain't this mess. End quote. So I want you to make sure you understand, because I heard down through the years so much about escapist preaching and talking about heaven only. Nick Peterson, I think, clears that up. Now let me say something about the Chitlin Circuit preachers who ended up on wax, on records and radio. Calvin P. Dixon, he was the first Black preacher to make a record. He was nicknamed Black Billy Sunday. He died in 1935. There were actually two Billy Sundays. The second one was J. Gordon McPherson. But Dixon really wasn't on the preaching circuit. However, he preached extensively in the 1920s. His first recorded sermon was "As an Eagle Stirs Up Her Nest." And on the flip side of the record was The Prodigal Son. Of course, he also preached on the Valley of the Dry Bones. And you can actually hear these sermons on YouTube. They're only 6 or 7 minutes for each side of a record. Then there was J.M. Gates, and we put him in the anthology of African American preaching. Gates recorded for Columbia, and he spoke the Black vernacular. His first sermons, "Death's Black Train is Coming," sold well all over the country. White producers had never seen anything like it. If you opened a Black newspaper, rather than reading about educated Black preachers, first you were more likely to see J.M. Gates, who began on the Chitlin Circuit, and even after achieving notoriety, he returned to that circuit. His sales easily eclipsed those of Calvin P. Dixon, who spoke in a formal, educated tone. From then on, Black preachers, most of whom were from the South, those who were covered in the newspapers of the day, they sounded like Gates. If you wanted to make a record, you tried to sound like Gates, not the Black Billy Sunday. J.M. Gates recorded over 90 sermons in 1926 alone. By 1941, he had recorded 200 records, making him the most recorded preacher of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. J.C. Barnett was another preacher who began on the Chitlin Circuit. Barnett taught himself to read and write, and he was considered scholarly by some. He was also recorded. I think he recorded about 35 or 45 sermons, if memory serves me correctly. Then there was A.W. Nix, who was a Baptist preacher, and he was best known for his sermon, "The Black Diamond Express to Hell." According to Lerone Martin, Nix recorded versions 1 through 6 of "The Black Diamond Express to Hell." It was that popular. It sold that well. F.W. McGee was a Kojic preacher, and he was on the early Chitlin Circuit, and then he recorded sermons. Ida B. Robinson was one of the few women who preached on the Chitlin Circuit before the 1940s, and she was not one of those who recorded. And there were a few women who recorded. Women like Rosa Horn did record, but there were very few records that they sold. What was the Black preaching circuit all about? In 1910, those who participated on the circuit were just 45 years removed from the end of the Civil War, which ended in 1865. In other words, the taste of the violence and enslavement was still fresh in the air and in their memories. Their African sensibilities had not been forgotten. Some had been taught about the griots and the shamans who were forcibly brought to the American shores. By 1910, these preachers still knew the sound of the drums, the clap, and the ring shout. So, what was the Chitlin circuit about for these preachers who had parents who had experienced slavery and the Reconstruction era, which was from 1865 to 1877? For preachers on the circuit, and you can determine this by reading books written about some of the preachers, including C.L. Franklin, and from newspapers. The Chitlin circuit represented an opportunities for preachers to preach as their Black embodied selves. They could jump, shout, and holler if they wanted to. Secondly, it was about preaching the gospel. Their faith in God was clear and authentic. Third, it was about an aesthetic and polysyllabic sound that was in their bones. That's why Calvin P. Dixon, who adopted the name of a white man and made records that sounded like a white man with a gruff voice, he had poor record sales. But those like J.M. Gates, who preached with power, melody, and unrestrained energy, they sold millions of records. They preached in the vernacular of the people. They were not trying to sound like the educated or formal preachers. Even if they were educated, they were not trying to sound like that. Fourth, it offered these preachers, those who did it, joy. And the joy was not only contagious, but it was cathartic for people living through daily hell. People loved hearing the preachers on the Chitlin circuit. It was cathartic. Fifth, for many of the preachers, it was a way to increase their chances of surviving financially. Every offering in any form helped. Lerone Martin, in his book Preaching on Wax, suggests that by the mid-1930s, many Black preachers who had churches only earned $1,000 a year as senior pastors, up to $1,500 a year. Next, the circuit was also about gaining notoriety. There was no doubt about it. You went on the Chitlin circuit in hopes of moving from a small church to a larger church and maybe even a national audience, like a convention. That's what C.L. Franklin did. Finally, for those who loved preaching, it was a welcomed outing. People got to hear preachers and hear about their experiences. Sometimes these preachers came from long distances to particular places on the circuit. And as I mentioned earlier, in many towns, people attended church only 2 Sundays a month. So these revivals, which could run from 4 to 7 days, they were a welcome change from the drudgery of a week and the fatigue that people had to deal with just living through Jim and Jane Crow, especially if they were sharecropping. So what did the circuit require? Early in its formation, the circuit was hard to do in many cases because it required travel when most Black folk could not afford a car, nor could most white folk for that matter. So these Black preachers, the early ones, some of them took mules. Then they took the train, on which they were never welcome. Trains were separated by race. And then they took buses, on which Black folk were not welcomed either. So the first thing you had to do on the preaching Chitlin circuit was get to the church where you were invited. Second, there was the matter of a place to stay during a period when a revival, as I said, could last 5 to 7 days. In most instances, the guest preacher stayed in the home of the pastor or the wealthiest member of the church. And this is also where they ate all their meals. Black folks were not welcomed in hotels and restaurants. Let me check and see. Do I have any questions? All right, you can put your questions in the chat. What else was the Chitlin Circuit about? There was the matter, of course, of pay. Like I said, in the early days of the circuit, you could be paid with hogs, flour, those kinds of things, all right, and a little bit of money. Typically on the Chitlin Circuit, all the preachers had were gentlemen's agreements. From the late 1800s to the 1920s, as I said, preachers, you could be paid with livestock and grain. In some cases, by the time the preacher arrived, the church could no longer afford to pay the agreed upon amount. If the preacher was young, he could get paid very little except for room and board. Okay. But most preachers still thought it worth it because they were on the circuit and it gave them some notoriety and they got to meet people and travel. Only a handful of established preachers made any money on the circuit until the early 1950s. Before that, you didn't make any money being on the circuit. By the time preachers like C.L. Franklin had become mainstay revivalists he rarely preached on the Chitlin Circuit anymore. In the 1930s, with Black denominations in full force, we had the AMEs, the National Baptists, the Church of God in Christ. Men who attended conventions could meet revivalists, and if you were on the circuit, you could also secure preaching engagement. And if you preached at the right occasion, your calendar on the Chitlin Circuit was full most of the year. Next, those who had established churches and a measure of education continued to demean the circuit. They continued to do it. And by 1930, we had a pretty decent number of educated Black preachers. And even if the numbers weren't huge, they were loud and they stayed in the newspapers, right? And most of their concern, of course, was how we appeared in public to white people. The churches in which the Chitlin Circuit preachers preached were typically small, with fewer than 100 people. They didn't have air conditioning, and an evening service or a Sunday afternoon service could last 3 hours or more, especially in Pentecostal churches that were part of the circuit. I mentioned some of the Chitlin Circuit preachers from 1920 to the 1940s. Who were some of the notable preachers on the circuit after that, specifically in the 1950s and 60s? And I think I posted this, and I got very few answers of people who were actually on the circuit in the 1950s and 60s, according to the late Reverend Fred Sampson, who was a good friend. He said he briefly preached on the circuit. Then there was Johnny Hurricane Jones, Leo Daniels, Jasper Williams, Bob Wilson of Dallas, Texas, Donald Parsons, and James Jones. Some of the women who were most often Pentecostal holiness who were on the circuit included Leora Ross, remember, I think I said she was one of the ones who recorded as well. Elder Lucy Smith, Mother Lizzie Woods Robinson, and Reverend Rosa Horn. Now, those women didn't use the term or reverend. They didn't use that term, but they did preach. Okay. They did preach in the 1960s and 70s. The circuit also, although still primarily occurring in Southern venues, saw many of its preachers preaching in cities such as Detroit, Chicago, New York, Baltimore, and elsewhere. And although these cities were not considered staples as part of the circuit, preachers sometimes rose from small churches in the South and a stint on the circuit to preach at larger places in the North. The circuit is still alive and well, and we know the names of the current people of the last 20 years or so who are on the circuit. There, of course, there's Mississippi Mitchell, Robert Smith out of Detroit, Leroy Elliott, Rodney McFadden, Tellus Chapman, who cut his teeth on the Chitlin circuit, and so did Clinton McFarland, Bertrand Bailey, the late E. Edward Jones, and one of the youngest on the circuit is John Terrius Tate. Now, you can see most of these preachers were senior pastors, and they had churches, and they preached everywhere else too, not just on the circuit, especially since social media. Okay. Now, when I posted this, I talked about the Chitlin circuit and hooping. So I do want to say a little bit about hooping. For an in-depth definition, please see Preaching with Sacred Fire, African American Sermons from 1750 to the present. You all know about that 960-page anthology. But I do want to say, just by way of explaining a little bit more about hooping, I want to use John Michael Spencer's definition. He says in his book, Sacred Symphony, the principal melodic mode employed by Black preachers in their tuning is the pentatonic, a scale common to African folk song and traditional Black spirituals. The pentatonic, including its subsets and chromatic mutations, is the principal mode shared by Black preachers who hoop, end quote. So regarding hooping styles, there are, of course, a variety of hooping styles. So when we talk about the matter of vocal musicality, hooping often involves a progression from spoken word to heightened rhythmic and melodic delivery. Rhythmic, and melodic delivery. The structure is deeply influenced by West African ritual and musical practice, in which the line between speech, chanting, and song is fluid. Not all hooping is created equal. It's just not. As with any art form, not all of the styles are created equal. There are melodic hoopers, and those are my favorites. There are guttural gasps. There are hackers and squallers. Okay. And you know what your favorite type was. Somebody asked the question, what are the pros and cons for today's preachers regarding the Chitlin circuit? Well, the pros were, as they've always been, you get an opportunity to improve as a preacher. You get to meet people. You get to deliver the word of God, and it's a lot easier to get around. You're paid better, and etc. In terms of the cons, if it's a con, I don't think people really care as much as they did. You still get demean. You still hear that only a holler, not a scholar, and they may not have ever heard you preach. Um, so, and then in terms of another pro, many preachers, as we know, the average church still has fewer than 75 members. So you also get to increase your income by being on the preaching circuit. Okay. Uh, so pro and con, there you go. Pro and con. And I personally think the Chitlin circuit is a wonderful way for preachers to improve their preaching and get to understand more about Black culture and our people. And on the notion of demeaning it, by the 1930s and 40s, only 4.3% of all Americans, Black, white, Latino, Asian, had a bachelor's degree. By the 1940s, the number was 4.6. Yet hooping was being demeaned consistently by a handful of educated Black preachers, sociologists, and scholars. And that's always interesting to me, that you would demean something that the people liked. The people don't care. They didn't care in the 1910s, 20s, 30s. They still don't care. If they can relate to the message is Bible centered. So they've never turned their backs on hooping just because what educated clergy and others have had to say. The people understand, even if they can't articulate it, they understand that this is an extraordinary art form that's given life by Black folk. That's why, as I posted this week, good hoopers will always have preaching engagements. No matter what you think about it, it is the case. Okay. And it does tick me off because I know it's just chasing white respectability. It does tick me off when people do that. You got to holler and you're not a scholar kind of stuff. Or put some meat on that bone before you holler. You need to put some meat on the bone, whether you holler or not. Okay? And I don't assume that because you can hoop, that you are uneducated. I don't assume that. I also don't assume that because you are educated, you can preach. And we certainly know from technology, the internet, etc., that we got a whole lot of preachers with educations who cannot preach. Okay? So I'm glad that the people keep choosing hooping. They keep choosing it. And yeah, there are preachers, hoopers, non-hoopers, etc., who have nothing to say. There are preachers who lean on their hoop because they know how powerful it is. All of that's true. But as I said, no matter whether you're a hooper or non-hooper, there are just people who cannot preach. Always have been. Okay. Let me close with a quick book list where you can find some of what I've talked about. Number one, for those especially who want to do research, the Black newspapers, especially the larger ones, and the newspapers of the South, they are a great place to begin. When I was working on the anthology, I loved reading the newspapers. There were so many of them, and they were so helpful when it came to learning about the Chitlin Circuit and the Black Church. The first book I want to offer is Sacred Symphony by John Michael Spencer. Sacred Symphony. I used John Michael Spencer's work as kind of the foundation when I did the article on hooping for preaching with the book, Preaching with Sacred Fire. Then you want to look at Ashon Crawley, A, S as in Sam, Hon. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. Ashon Crawley's book, Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility. Some great material in there in understanding preaching, hooping, musicality, and those kinds of things, tonality, etc. Also, Braxton Shelley's An Eternal Pitch, Bishop G.E. Patterson, Broadcast Religion and the Afterlives of Ecstasy. That's a long title. But if you just look up Braxton Shelley, An Eternal Pitch, Bishop G.E. Patterson, you will see the book. Then there is the book Preaching on Wax by Lerone Martin, where he gives just a very detailed history of preachers who recorded records. Then there's a great article called The CHITLIN Circuit and the Road to Rock and Roll by Preston Lauterbach, L-A-U-T as in Tom, E-R-B-A-C-H, The CHITLIN Circuit and the Road to Rock and Roll. And he chronicles how there were so many who did everything from entertainment, and certainly those who were in the juke joints and elsewhere who were on the circuit. He does a lot of good stuff on the singing, the blues, soul, jazz circuit. And again, like I said, it's the CHITLIN Circuit and the Road to Rock and Roll. That is it for me. And I know that was a lot, and I usually don't do long discussions about one subject like that. But like I said, I hadn't done it before, and I think it's important. I really do think it's important, and I hope it was helpful. And I really hope that researchers, especially, and that everyone else, but especially researchers, because I know they're looking at these kinds of things. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for hitting my Cash App as an independent scholar so that I can keep doing this kind of work and bringing you the great guests like the guest we have in August, who will talk about how to avoid foreclosure and chaplaincy. Okay. So I hope you all enjoyed that. If you are on YouTube watching this, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. And if you're on Facebook, as I always say, please share the video. It won't cost you anything. Share the video. Let me see. Do we have any? I was looking to see if I had missed any questions. I don't think so. All right. So that's it for me. God bless. I hope that you all have a great week, and I'll see you in August, beginning with how to avoid foreclosure. Take care. Share the video.